I discovered my husband had spent $50,000 of our savings on his girlfriend's business while I was in the hospital recovering from emergency surgery. 6 months later, I quietly became the anonymous buyer who purchased her failing boutique, then shut it down the day he planned to propose to her there. But this isn't a story about revenge. It's about reclaiming my worth and discovering that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't destruction, but transformation. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Mrs. Parker, the doctor says you're stable enough for visitors now. The nurse's voice seemed to come from somewhere far away as I slowly emerged from the fog of anesthesia. My abdomen throbbed with a dull, persistent pain that the medications couldn't quite mask. Emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix isn't how anyone plans to spend their anniversary. But here I was, drifting in and out of consciousness in a hospital bed instead of enjoying the weekend getaway Greg and I had planned. He's been waiting outside for hours, the nurse added with a sympathetic smile, adjusting my IV drip. Your husband seems very worried. I nodded weakly, grateful that Greg had been there when I collapsed in our kitchen that morning, that he'd called the ambulance immediately. 22 hours later, I was finally stable enough to see him. When Greg entered, his face showed the strain of someone who hadn't slept. His normally meticulously styled brown hair was disheveled, and his blue button-down shirt was wrinkled. He crossed the room quickly, taking my hand in his. "Claire, thank God," he whispered, pressing his lips to my knuckles. "When they took you into surgery, He broke off, swallowing hard. "Some anniversary, huh?" I managed, my voice raspy. "Sorry about Napa." "Don't be ridiculous," he said. "All that matters is that you're okay." Greg stayed until visiting hours ended, scrolling through his phone while I drifted in and out of sleep. Just before leaving, he placed my own phone on the bedside table. "Your mom's been texting. I told her everything's fine, but she'll want to hear from you when you're up to it. I'm going home to shower and grab some things for you. Need anything specific?" I asked for my charger, toiletry bag, and the novel I'd been reading. As he bent to kiss my forehead, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A flicker of something, annoyance, anxiety, crossed his face before he composed himself. "That's probably the office. I'll be back first thing tomorrow." After he left, I reached for my own phone, wanting to text my mother that I was okay. The battery was nearly dead, odd, since Greg knew I kept it fully charged. As I plugged it in with the hospital room's spare charger, I noticed dozens of notifications from our joint banking app. Greg and I maintained a common account for major expenses and savings, while keeping separate accounts for personal spending, AEI, system that had worked well throughout our 8 years of marriage. I opened the app, assuming Greg had paid the hospital's initial billing department. What I saw made my surgical pain momentarily vanish. A transfer of $50,000 from our joint savings to Greg's personal account, timestamped just 3 hours after I'd gone into surgery. My finger hovered over the screen. There had to be an explanation. Greg was an account executive at a marketing firm. Comfortable salary, but not extravagant. We'd been saving for years for a down payment on a house, finally accumulating just over $120,000. We'd agreed never to touch that money without discussing it first. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. "Greg, it's me. I saw the bank transfer. Call me back immediately." While waiting, I opened our shared cloud storage on my phone, where we kept important documents. Greg had always handled most of our finances, with my grateful blessing. I'd never been particularly interested in spreadsheets and budgets, trusting him implicitly with this aspect of our life together. Now, that trust felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. I found our tax returns, insurance policies, investment statements, all neatly organized as expected. Then I noticed a folder I didn't recognize. Monarch Consulting. Inside were invoices, a business plan, and a lease agreement for commercial property in downtown Seattle, all dated within the last 4 months. The invoices were addressed to Monarch Boutique and issued to Madison Hayes, a name I'd never heard Greg mention. My hands were shaking as I opened the lease agreement. There it was in black and white, a rental contract for a retail space in the trendy Pioneer Square district, co-signed by Greg Parker and Madison Hayes. I closed my eyes, the implications crashing over me in waves. The surgery pain returned with a vengeance joined by a new, sharper ache in my chest. My phone rang. Greg. Claire, I can explain. Who is Madison Hayes? I interrupted, my voice eerily calm. The silence that followed told me everything. I was going to tell you, he finally said. After you recover. It's not what you think. Really? Because I think you've been funding another woman's business with our house savings while I've been working 60-hour weeks at the law firm to contribute to that fund. It's an investment opportunity, Greg said quickly. Madison has this amazing concept for a boutique, sustainable fashion, locally sourced, in Pioneer Square, with our money, without even mentioning it to me. My voice rose, causing a nurse to glance through the window of my hospital room with concern. I knew you wouldn't understand the vision, Greg said, his tone shifting from apologetic to defensive. Madison has experience in retail. The market analysis shows— Is she your girlfriend? I asked flatly. Another telling silence. It's complicated, he finally said. I hung up. The next hours passed in a blur. I called my best friend Vanessa, who arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes, her face flushed with fury on my behalf. I forwarded her the documents I'd found and asked her to take screenshots, a lawyer's instinct kicking in, even through my emotional haze. What can I do? Vanessa asked, squeezing my hand. Find me a divorce attorney, I replied. And maybe some ice cream. She managed both, returning with the contact information for Seattle's most formidable divorce lawyer and a contraband cup of chocolate chip cookie dough that the night nurse pretended not to see. When Greg returned the next morning, Vanessa was still there, arms crossed, positioned like a sentinel beside my bed. Claire, we need to talk privately, Greg said, casting an annoyed glance at Vanessa. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of her, I replied. He exhaled sharply. Fine, yes. Madison and I have been seeing each other. It started 6 months ago. But the business is legitimate. It's not just about us. I genuinely believe in what she's creating. With our house fund, I said. I'll pay it back, he insisted. Once the boutique starts turning a profit, 60% of new retail businesses fail within the first year, I interrupted. 78% of boutiques specifically. Did your market analysis mention that? Greg looked startled. He'd forgotten I'd worked on bankruptcy cases early in my legal career, that I knew the statistics all too well. This is different, he insisted. Madison has connections in the industry. The location is perfect. We've already secured inventory. From sustainable suppliers, I repeated. Interesting choice of pronoun. He ran his hands through his hair in frustration. Look, I know this is a shock. I handled it badly. But I'm trying to be honest now. Now that I've caught you, I said. Not when you were emptying our account. Not during the 4 months you've apparently been planning this boutique. Not during the 6 months you've been sleeping with this woman. I want a divorce, Greg said suddenly. This isn't working. It hasn't been for a long time. Madison understands me in ways you never have. The surgical pain medication must have been wearing off, because I felt every word like a physical blow. 8 years of marriage, dismissed in a hospital room while I was still connected to IV fluids. Get out, Vanessa said, rising from her chair, before I call security. After Greg left, I lay back against the pillows, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with my surgical recovery. What am I going to do? I whispered. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Vanessa took my hand. First, you're going to heal. Then we're going to make that bastard regret the day he ever heard the name Madison Hayes. But as I drifted back to sleep, it wasn't revenge I was thinking about. It was something my grandmother, a federal judge for 30 years, used to say. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. But make sure you show them who you are too. Greg had shown me exactly who he was. Now it was my turn. The days that followed brought a parade of indignities large and small. Greg moved out of our apartment while I was still in the hospital, taking not only his belongings but several items that were unquestionably mine, including a pair of diamond earrings my grandmother had given me when I passed the bar exam. My recovery was complicated by an infection at the surgical site, extending my hospital stay to 7 days. During this time, Greg filed for divorce, the papers delivered to my hospital bed by a courier who looked deeply uncomfortable with his task. The terms Greg proposed were breathtaking in their audacity. A 70-30 split of our assets in his favor, claiming his business investments should be protected, with no mention of the $50,000 he'd already diverted. "He can't be serious," said Catherine Drummond, the divorce attorney Vanessa had connected me with, as she reviewed the papers in my hospital room. Catherine was in her 50s, with steel gray hair and the carefully neutral expression of someone who had seen everything the dissolution of marriage could offer. "Oh, I think he is," I replied. "Greg has always had an inflated sense of his own contributions." "Well, he's about to get a reality check," Catherine said, making notes. "Washington is a community property state. That $50,000 was marital property, removed without consent during your medical emergency. No judge will look kindly on that. When I was finally discharged, I returned not to our shared apartment, but to Vanessa's guest room. The thought of sleeping in the bed Greg and I had shared made me physically ill. Vanessa, a pediatric surgeon with unconventional hours, was the perfect housemate for someone in crisis, present when needed, respectfully absent when not. "Have you looked her up yet?" Vanessa asked one evening, setting a glass of wine in front of me. I didn't pretend not to know who she meant. "No." "I have," she admitted. "Madison Hayes, 27, former visual merchandiser for Nordstrom. Very active on Instagram. Lots of photos with Greg from the last 4 months." My heart clenched. "They've been public? While we were still—" "I'm sorry," Vanessa said quietly. "He's been taking her to events, industry parties, restaurant openings." Took a long sip of wine, feeling the burn all the way down. "And the boutique?" "Monarch Boutique. Set to open next month in Pioneer Square. There's a website, very sleek. Sustainable fashion for the modern woman. Whatever that means." I nodded, absorbing this. "Show me," Vanessa hesitated. "Are you sure you're ready?" "No," I admitted. "But I need to know what I'm dealing with." She pulled up the Monarch Boutique website on her tablet. It was indeed sleek, professionally designed, with muted earth tones and elegant typography. Madison Hayes smiled from the About page, a willowy blonde with perfect teeth and the confident posture of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Monarch Boutique represents my lifelong dream," her bio read. "After years in corporate retail, I'm thrilled to bring my vision of sustainable, ethical fashion to Seattle's discerning shoppers." No mention of her investor, of course. No acknowledgement that her lifelong dream was being funded by another woman's savings. I scrolled through the site, noting the grand opening date, the brands she would carry, the unique shopping experience she promised. It was all very professionally presented, I had to admit. If I hadn't known the truth behind it, I might have been impressed. Then I saw it, a small partners section at the bottom of the page. Listed among the sustainable brands and local artisans was Parker Marketing Group. "Parker Marketing Group?" I echoed. "Greg doesn't have a marketing group. He works for Meridian Associates." Vanessa and I exchanged looks. "Not anymore, apparently," she said, opening another browser tab. A quick search revealed Parker Marketing Group, a newly registered LLC with Greg Parker listed as founder and CEO. He quit his job, I said, disbelieving. He left a secure position to start his own firm, while simultaneously draining our savings for his girlfriend's boutique. I laughed, the sound harsh even to my own ears. He's either extraordinarily confident or extraordinarily stupid. Why? Not both, Vanessa suggested, refilling my wine glass. That night, lying in Vanessa's guest bed, I realized I'd been asking the wrong questions. Instead of dwelling on what Greg had done, I needed to focus on what I would do next. I'd spent 8 years subordinating my career to support Greg's, taking on less demanding cases to maintain our home life, declining opportunities that would have required travel or additional hours. I'd believed in our partnership, our shared future. Now, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I felt something shift inside me. The initial shock and pain were still there, but alongside them grew something new, a cold, clear certainty. This wasn't just about Greg's betrayal or Madison's boutique. This was about reclaiming my agency, my ambition, my sense of self. I reached for my phone and opened my contacts, scrolling to a name I hadn't called in years. Michael Whitman, managing partner at Whitman & Associates, the firm that had aggressively recruited me out of law school before I chose a smaller practice that would allow me more time for my marriage. It was nearly midnight, so I composed an email instead of calling. Michael, it's been a while. I find myself at a professional and personal crossroads. If your offer to join Whitman & Associates is still open in any capacity, I'd like to discuss possibilities. My circumstances have changed, and I'm ready for new challenges. Claire Parker. I hesitated only briefly before hitting send, then set my phone aside and closed my eyes. For the first time since seeing that bank transfer notification in my hospital room, I felt something like peace. Whatever came next, it would be on my terms. Michael Whitman responded to my email by 7 a.m. the next morning. Claire, I've been hoping to hear from you for years. My offer has always remained open. Let's meet today. My office, 2 p.m. Bring your CV if it's updated, but don't worry if not. We have a lot to discuss. Michael. I stared at my phone, a strange lightness spreading through my chest. I hadn't expected such an immediate response, especially not one so enthusiastic. I'd spent years believing I'd burned that bridge when I declined Whitman & Associates' offer for a position at a smaller firm that would accommodate my marriage. Now, it seemed that the door hadn't been closed after all. Vanessa found me at the kitchen table, already dressed in the one professional outfit I'd brought to her apartment. You look ready for battle, she observed, pouring herself coffee. Job. Interview, I explained, showing her Michael's email. Or something like it. Her eyebrows rose. Whitman & Associates? The firm that practically begged you to join them after law school? The one Greg said was too demanding and would destroy. Our work-life balance? I nodded, something bitter twisting in my stomach at the memory. Funny how concerned he was about our work-life balance when it was my career at stake. While happily letting you work 60-hour weeks at Daniels & Moore to contribute to the savings he stole, Vanessa added, her tone acid. Go get him, Claire. Show Whitman what he missed out on all these years. I spent the morning updating my CV, grateful that I'd at least maintained a folder of my case notes and achievements even during the years when I'd downplayed my professional ambitions. My work at Daniels & Moore had been solid, if not as cutting-edge, as what I might have done at Whitman. I'd specialized in corporate law, with a focus on mergers and acquisitions, skills that suddenly seemed more relevant than ever. At 1:30, I arrived at the gleaming downtown tower that housed Whitman & Associates. My heart hammering against my ribs, the receptionist directed me to the 37th floor, where Michael himself was waiting by the elevator banks. Claire Parker, he said warmly, extending his hand. 8 years too late. But who's counting? Michael hadn't changed much, still tall and lean with salt and pepper hair and penetrating dark eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. He'd been a legend even when I was in law school, known for his aggressive corporate takeovers and his ability to identify legal talent. He led me not to a conference room, but to his corner office, with its sweeping views of Elliott Bay. "So," he said, settling behind his desk, "what happened to change your mind after all this time? And please don't sugarcoat it. I've always appreciated your directness." I took a deep breath. My husband emptied our savings to fund his girlfriend's boutique while I was in emergency surgery. I'm getting divorced and reevaluating every aspect of my life, including the career compromises I made for a marriage that's now over. Michael blinked, clearly not expecting such brutal honesty. Then he laughed. "Damn, Claire. I asked for directions, but that's something else." His expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry about your personal situation, but professionally speaking, your timing couldn't be better." He pulled a folder from his desk, a folder with my name on it. "I've kept tabs on your work at Daniels and more. Your handling of the Technova acquisition last year was impressively thorough. You found tax implications their own counsel missed." I was startled. "You've been monitoring my career?" "I make it a point to track the ones that got away," he said simply. "And I've always believed you were operating at half capacity at Daniels. No offense to Sarah Daniels. She runs a fine boutique firm. But your talents deserve a bigger stage." Opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be a job description. "We're expanding our corporate acquisitions division, focusing specifically on distressed assets and turnaround opportunities. The position would involve identifying acquisition targets, conducting due diligence, and structuring deals that transform struggling businesses." My pulse quickened. This was exactly the kind of work I'd dreamed of doing before I'd adjusted my ambitions to fit my married life. "The compensation package is aggressive," Michael continued, sliding a paper across the desk. I glanced at the figure and nearly choked. It was more than double my current salary. "This seems generous," I managed. "It's market rate for the level of expertise required," Michael replied matter-of-factly. "Plus considerations of what you're worth and what you've missed out on." He leaned forward. "Claire, I'm not offering this out of pity or because of your personal situation. I'm offering it because you're exactly who we need. Your legal skills combined with your ability to spot hidden value, it's a rare combination." For the first time since discovering Greg's betrayal, I felt something like excitement stirring within me. This wasn't just an escape route from my collapsing personal life. It was an opportunity to reclaim professional ambitions I'd set aside years ago. "When would you want me to start?" I asked. "Yesterday," Michael said with a slight smile. "But realistically, I understand you need to extricate yourself from Daniels and Moore properly. 2 weeks? A month outside?" I nodded slowly. "I can give notice tomorrow. Sarah will understand." I hesitated. "There's just one thing. My divorce is likely to get messy. I don't want that to reflect poorly on the firm." Michael waved a dismissive hand. "Half our attorneys are divorced. It's practically a prerequisite for working the hours we do." His expression turned shrewd. "Though I am curious, what exactly do you mean by messy?" I carefully considered how much to reveal. My soon-to-be ex-husband diverted significant marital assets to fund his girlfriend's business venture. I intend to recover those assets through all legal channels available." "Understandable," Michael nodded. "And this business venture, what is it?" "A boutique, sustainable fashion in Pioneer Square. Opening next month." Something flickered in Michael's eyes. Interest, calculation. "Retail is a brutal sector even in the best circumstances. Undercapitalized new ventures fail at an astonishing rate." "I'm aware," I said. "In fact, I worked on several retail bankruptcy cases early in my career." Michael studied me for a long moment. "You know, Claire, some of the most valuable legal education happens outside the courtroom. Experience with the practical aspects of business distress and recovery can be illuminating." I wasn't entirely sure what he was suggesting, but I sensed an opening. I've always believed in practical education. Good. He stood, extending his hand. Welcome to Whitman and Associates. I'll have HR send over the formal offer letter this afternoon. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, my mind raced with possibilities. Michael's cryptic comments about business distress and recovery seemed to hint at something beyond the job offer. An endorsement, perhaps, of whatever path I chose regarding Greg and Madison's boutique. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe fully. I had a direction, a purpose that extended beyond reacting to Greg's betrayal. Whatever came next, I would face it from a position of growing strength rather than diminishing vulnerability. When I returned to Vanessa's apartment, I found her at the kitchen table with her laptop open to property listings. I'm looking at rentals for you, she explained. Unless you're planning to fight for the apartment? I shook my head. Too many memories, and honestly, I think I'd like something completely different. A fresh start. How was the interview? She asked. I handed her the salary figure Michael had written down. Her eyes widened. Holy Claire, this is amazing. I know, I said, still processing it myself. It's the job I should have taken 8 years ago, the one Greg convinced me would be too demanding for a healthy marriage. Vanessa's expression darkened. He never deserved you. Even before all this. She gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire betrayal situation. Maybe not, I agreed. But I allowed it. I bought into the idea that my ambition needed to be tempered for our relationship to work. I sat down across from her. No more. I'm done diminishing myself. Amen to that, Vanessa said, raising her coffee mug in toast. So what's next, besides the amazing new job? I need information, I said. About Madison's boutique, about Greg's new marketing group, about their financial situation. Catherine's handling the divorce proceedings, but there's something else I need to understand. What's that? Whether there's a way to recover not just the money Greg took, but everything I've lost in this process, including my dignity. Vanessa's eyes glinted. Now that sounds like the Claire I know. The next morning, I gave notice at Daniels & Moore. Sarah Daniels, a petite woman in her 60s who had built her firm from nothing after her own divorce 30 years earlier, listened to my explanation with surprising understanding. I always knew you were destined for bigger things, she said after I'd finished. And while I hate losing you, I have to say, seeing you finally stand up for your own career is deeply satisfying. I blinked back unexpected tears. I didn't realize you saw it that way. Claire, you're brilliant. One of the sharpest legal minds I've ever worked with. But you've been holding yourself back, and we both know why. She didn't need to say Greg's name. Go show Whitman what you're really capable of. And as for the divorce, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a business card. Call Melissa Tanner. She's the best forensic accountant in Seattle. She'll track every penny your husband diverted. I thanked her, touched by her support, and returned to my office to begin transitioning my cases. As I sorted through files, I came across documents from a retail bankruptcy I'd handled 3 years earlier. A small chain of locally owned boutiques that had overextended during expansion. I pulled the file, remembering the lessons from that. Case about cash flow, inventory management, and the razor-thin margins of specialty retail. That evening, I met with Melissa Tanner at her downtown office. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with a practical bob and no-nonsense glasses. Sarah Daniels says you're dealing with financial infidelity, Melissa said, getting straight to the point. Walk me through what you know. I explained the $50,000 transfer, the discovery of Monarch Boutique, and Greg's apparent career change to form Parker Marketing Group. Melissa took notes, occasionally nodding. Classic case, she said when I finished. Unfortunately, I see this pattern frequently. Spouse diverts assets to either fund an affair or, more commonly, to hide money before initiating divorce. The business angle is a twist, but it actually makes our job easier. How so? I asked. Businesses leave paper trails, she explained. Registrations, licenses, contracts, vendor agreements, loans, credit applications. Your husband isn't just hiding money under a mattress. He's creating documented financial relationships that we can trace and quantify. So you can track the $50,000. I can track that and more, Melissa said confidently. For instance, did you know business loans often require personal guarantees? If your husband obtained additional financing for either his marketing company or his girlfriend's boutique, he may have pledged marital assets as collateral. I hadn't considered this possibility. That would be illegal without my consent, wouldn't it? Absolutely, Melissa confirmed. But people in the midst of deception rarely think clearly about consequences. She tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. Here's what I need from you. All bank statements for the past year, tax returns for the past 3 years, credit card statements, investment accounts, and any business documents you can access. I nodded. I've already gathered most of that for Catherine, my divorce attorney. Perfect. I'll coordinate with her. Melissa hesitated, then added, There's one more thing that might be helpful. Access to your husband's email or cloud storage accounts. I thought of the shared cloud storage where I'd first discovered the Monarch Boutique documents. I have access to our shared cloud account, though he may have removed himself from it by now. Check as soon as possible, Melissa advised. People are surprisingly careless about digital footprints, especially when they believe their actions are justified. On my way back to Vanessa's apartment, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. Claire, it's Greg. We need to talk. About the divorce terms. My lawyer says your counteroffer is unreasonable. Call me. I stared at the message, anger bubbling up afresh. Of course he would think my counteroffer was unreasonable. Catherine had responded to his insulting 70-30 split, with a demand for 65% of our assets in my favor, plus complete repayment of the diverted $50,000 with interest. Instead of responding to Greg, I checked our shared cloud storage account. Surprisingly, he hadn't removed his access or changed the password. Either he'd forgotten about it in the chaos of his new life, or he didn't think I'd bother looking there again. What I found exceeded my wildest expectations. Greg, methodical, to a fault, had continued using the cloud to store documents related to both Parker Marketing Group and Monarch Boutique. There were updated business plans, cash flow projections, loan applications, and, most interestingly, a calendar of upcoming events at the boutique. The grand opening was scheduled for May 15th, just 3 weeks away. Following that was a series of promotional events, trunk shows, and a special celebration marked only with a champagne glass emoji on June 20th. I forwarded everything to Melissa, then called Catherine to update her on my findings. This is excellent, she said after I explained. The more documentation we have of his financial entanglements, the stronger our position. I've scheduled your deposition for next week and his for the following Monday. He wants to talk about the divorce terms, I told her. He texted me directly. Catherine's tone sharpened. Do not engage without me present. Direct all communication through me. He's trying to manipulate you emotionally to accept less than you deserve. I understand, I assured her, though part of me itched to confront Greg directly, to make him acknowledge what he'd done. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the boutique's upcoming opening, about Madison Hayes and her lifelong dream built with my savings, about Greg starting his marketing company while I'd been worried about work-life balance. I pulled up the Monarch Boutique website again, studying it with new eyes. The business plan I'd found in the cloud storage revealed more than just the boutique's aesthetic vision. It included financial projections, vendor relationships, and marketing strategies. According to Greg's own analysis, The boutique would require at least 6 months of operation before breaking even, assuming optimistic sales projections. The initial $50,000 investment, my money, was designated for lease deposits, fixtures, and initial inventory. But the projected monthly operating costs were substantial, and the cash flow models showed a precarious balance for the first year. In short, Monarch Boutique's success was far from guaranteed. One bad month, one inventory miscalculation, one market shift could send it into a tailspin. And suddenly, like a key turning in a lock, an idea began to form. Not just for recovering what Greg had taken, but for reclaiming something far more valuable, my sense of agency, my power to determine what happened next. I opened my laptop and began making notes, mapping out a strategy that would require all the legal and business acumen I'd developed over my career. By the time dawn broke, I had the outline of a plan so audacious that it both terrified and exhilarated me. This wouldn't be about revenge, though Greg might see it that way. It would be about justice, not just financial, but existential. About showing Greg, Madison, and most importantly myself, exactly who Claire Parker really was when she stopped constraining herself to fit someone else's expectations. I picked up my phone and composed a text to Michael Whitman. Need to discuss a potential distressed asset acquisition. Personal, not firm-related. Breakfast tomorrow? His response came within minutes, despite the early hour. 7 a.m. Café Laurent on 5th. Intrigued. I smiled, feeling the first stirrings of something I hadn't experienced in far too long. The pure, electric thrill of taking control of my own story. Café Laurent was already bustling when I arrived at 6:55 a.m. Michael Whitman sat at a corner table, the Wall Street Journal open before him, a steaming espresso at his elbow. He spotted me immediately, folding his paper with practiced efficiency. "Claire," he greeted me, rising slightly. "You look like you haven't slept." "Is it that obvious?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. "The dark circles suit you," he said with a slight smile. "They suggest determination." He signaled, "For the waiter." "What are we having?" "The avocado toast here is surprisingly good." After ordering breakfast, I pulled a slim folder from my bag and placed it on the table. "I need your perspective on something. Not as my employer, but as someone who specializes in acquisitions." Michael's eyebrows rose with interest. "I'm listening." "Hypothetically," I began, "how would one go about acquiring a retail business that's about to open but is likely undercapitalized?" He studied me for a moment, then glanced at the folder I'd placed between us. "This wouldn't happen to be related to a certain boutique in Pioneer Square?" I nodded, opening the folder to reveal the business plans and financial projections I'd discovered in the cloud storage. Monarch Boutique, funded primarily with $50,000 of my savings, accessed without my knowledge or consent. Michael picked up the documents, scanning them with the experienced eye of someone who had evaluated hundreds of business prospects. "Initial impressions?" "The concept isn't terrible," I admitted. "Sustainable fashion, locally sourced where possible. Madison Hayes, the owner." I managed to say the word without visible emotion. "Has industry experience as a visual merchandiser, but the financial structure is precarious. The $50,000 covers startup costs, but their operating capital is thin. One bad month could sink them." Michael nodded, continuing to flip through the pages. "Their cash flow projections are optimistic at best, delusional at worst. First-year customer acquisition costs alone will eat them alive." He looked up. "So, what exactly are you considering, Claire?" "I want to buy it," I said simply. "Not immediately. I want to wait until they're operational, experiencing the inevitable cash flow problems of a new retail venture, and then approach as an anonymous investor." Michael's expression shifted from professional interest to something like admiration. "You're not just looking to recover your $50,000. You want to acquire the entire business. Yes. And then? I met his gaze directly. And then I'll decide its fate based on its actual market viability, with the added satisfaction of having reclaimed what was taken from me and transformed it into something under my control. Michael leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. Remind me never to cross you, Claire Parker. He tapped the folder thoughtfully. It's an elegant approach. Rather than just fighting for the $50,000 in divorce proceedings, you're positioning yourself to acquire a business that, properly managed, might actually return your investment and more. Exactly, I said, relief washing through me that he understood. This isn't about revenge, it's about turning a betrayal into an opportunity. The timing will be crucial, Michael noted, slipping back into his role as acquisition specialist. Too early, and they'll still have the initial capital to rebuff you. Too late, and there might be nothing left to salvage. I was thinking 2 to 3 months after opening, I said. Long enough for reality to set in, but before they're in, complete free fall. Michael nodded approvingly. You'll need a shell company to approach them, something untraceable to you. I've already looked into it, I confirmed. I can establish an LLC in Delaware with minimal disclosure requirements. Smart, and you'll need representatives to handle the negotiations, people they've never met, who can't be connected to you. This was the part I was less certain about. I have ideas, but I'm open to suggestions. Michael considered for a moment. I know people who handle these sorts of negotiations regularly. Former associates who now work as independent consultants. Discreet, professional, effective. That would be extremely helpful, I admitted. Consider it done. He returned to the financial documents. What's interesting here is that they've projected significant revenue from corporate partnerships, local, businesses ordering custom merchandise, event sponsorships, that sort of thing. I hadn't focused on that aspect. Is that unusual? For a new boutique, yes. It suggests they're counting on business relationships that may not materialize. It's actually their most vulnerable point. He looked up. Who's handling their marketing? Parker? Marketing group, I said, unable to keep the irony from my voice. Greg's new venture. Understanding dawned in Michael's eyes. Ah! So your husband is essentially double-dipping, taking your money to fund his girlfriend's boutique, then creating a company that will bill the boutique for marketing services. Apparently so. That might actually work in your favor, Michael mused. If his marketing efforts fail to deliver the corporate partnerships they're projecting, their cash position will deteriorate even faster. Our food arrived, temporarily pausing the conversation. As we ate, I found myself studying Michael with new appreciation. His analytical approach, free from the emotional complications that clouded my own thinking, was exactly what I needed. There's a legal question I'm struggling with, I admitted after a few bites. If I succeed in acquiring Monarch Boutique, how does that affect the divorce proceedings? The $50,000 is already a point of contention. Michael considered this, spreading jam on his toast with surgical precision. It's complicated. On one hand, you would be recovering the diverted marital assets through business acquisition. On the other, you'd be creating a new asset that might itself become subject to division. Unless the acquisition happens after the divorce is finalized, I suggested. Precisely. Timing, as I said, is everything. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. Have you discussed any of this with your divorce attorney? Not yet. I wanted to make sure the approach was viable first. It's more than viable, Claire. It's inspiring. His expression turned more serious. But I should warn you, acquisitions are rarely clean or simple. Emotions run high, especially in small businesses where the owners are personally invested. Your husband and his girlfriend will not go quietly. I'm counting on it, I replied, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. After breakfast, energized by Michael's support and practical advice, I headed to the offices of Melissa Tanner, the forensic accountant. She greeted me with a cup of coffee and a folder even thicker than the one I'd shown Michael. "You've been busy," I observed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Financial infidelity fascinates me," she admitted, opening the folder to reveal spreadsheets, bank statements, and what appeared to be loan documents. "Most people think they're cleverer than they actually are when it comes to hiding money. Your husband is no exception." She walked me through her findings, pointing out not just the initial $50,000 transfer but several smaller movements of funds that I hadn't even noticed. "He's been siphoning money in increments of $2,000 to $3,000 for months," she explained, highlighting transactions on a bank statement. "Started about 7 months ago, roughly when I'm guessing the affair began." I felt a fresh wave of betrayal. The timing aligned perfectly with when Greg had started working late regularly, claiming a major marketing campaign was consuming his evenings and weekends. In total, beyond the $50,000, he's diverted approximately $28,000 in smaller transfers, Melissa continued. Some went directly to Madison Hayes's personal account, some to a joint business account they established for Monarch Boutique. $78,000 total, I murmured, the figure landing like a physical blow. Nearly 2/3 of our house fund gone. That's just the direct transfers, Melissa clarified. There are also joint credit card accounts with significant balances, about $32,000 spread across 3 cards. Most charges are clearly for the boutique: fixtures, inventory purchases, website development, promotional materials. So all told, approximately $110,000 diverted from marital assets to fund this business venture and, presumably, the affair itself. I sat back, momentarily overwhelmed by the scale of the deception. It wasn't just the emergency surgery transfer. It was a calculated, months-long campaign to secretly finance not just a girlfriend, but an entirely new life. "There's one more thing you should see," Melissa said, turning to her computer. I did some digging into Parker Marketing Group. She pulled up a business registration document. Greg established the LLC 4 months ago, but here's what's interesting. Madison Hayes is listed as Chief Creative Officer with a 40% ownership stake. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "She's co-owner of his marketing company?" "Yes. And based on their business plan, which thank you for forwarding from the cloud storage, Monarch Boutique is currently Parker Marketing Group's only client. They've essentially created a circular arrangement where money flows from the boutique to the marketing company and back again." "Is that legal?" I asked, my legal mind whirring despite my emotional response. "It's legal if properly disclosed and accounted for," Melissa said carefully. "It becomes problematic when marital assets are diverted without consent to fund both entities in the arrangement. And it becomes very interesting in divorce proceedings." She turned back to her files, pulling out a loan application. They've also applied for a small business loan of $75,000, using the boutique's projected revenue as justification. It's still pending approval. "Do they need my signature for that since we're still legally married?" "Technically, yes, especially if any marital property is used as collateral. But there's no indication of your signature on these documents, which is another issue your attorney should raise." I made a note to update Catherine immediately. The more I learned, the more calculated Greg's actions appeared. This wasn't a momentary lapse or a midlife crisis. It was a methodical dismantling of our shared financial future to build something that excluded me entirely. "Given all this," I said carefully, "what's your assessment of Monarch Boutiques?" "Financial viability?" Melissa adjusted her glasses. "Based on the projections versus the reality of their capital position, I give it 6 months, maximum, before serious cash flow problems emerge. Their initial capitalization is inadequate for their planned inventory levels and operating expenses. They're counting heavily on strong initial sales and rapid growth of corporate partnerships, both of which are highly uncertain in retail," I noted. "Precisely. Unless they secure additional investment within the first few months, they'll likely face a capital crisis by fall." This aligned perfectly with my emerging strategy. I thanked Melissa for her thorough work and headed to my meeting with Catherine Drummond, my divorce attorney, to share these findings. Catherine's office exuded the quiet power of old money: oak paneling, leather-bound law books, discreet artwork. Catherine herself, in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, reviewed Melissa's findings with growing satisfaction. "This is exceptional documentation of financial misconduct," she said, making notes in her precise handwriting. "The circular business arrangement between Monarch Boutique and Parker Marketing Group particularly strengthens our case for an unequal division of assets in your favor." "How should we proceed?" I asked. "Aggressively," Catherine said without hesitation. "I'll file an emergency motion to freeze all remaining joint assets and to prohibit any further business transactions using marital property as collateral." She looked up. "Your deposition is scheduled for tomorrow. Greg's is next Monday. I want to blindside him with these findings during his testimony." I nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else I'm considering that might complicate matters." Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly, inviting me to continue. I explained my idea to acquire Monarch Boutique through an anonymous investment vehicle once their cash flow problems inevitably emerged. Catherine listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. "It's unorthodox," she said when I finished, "but potentially brilliant. From a legal standpoint, the key is ensuring the acquisition happens after the divorce is finalized. Otherwise, the business itself could become a marital asset subject to division." "How long will the divorce take?" I asked. "Washington has a mandatory 90-day waiting period after filing. Given the complications of your case, I'd estimate 4 to 6 months. Total, assuming Greg doesn't drag things out deliberately. And can we prevent him from taking on more debt or making major business decisions during that time?" "Yes, with the emergency motion I mentioned. We can effectively constrain his ability to further entangle marital assets with these business ventures." She made another note. "I'll file it this afternoon." I left Catherine's office feeling oddly centered despite the chaos swirling around me. For the first time since discovering Greg's betrayal, I had a clear path forward, not just for the divorce, but for reclaiming what was rightfully mine in a way that would transform the narrative completely. That evening, I met with Vanessa to update her on everything I'd learned and the strategy that was taking shape. "Let me get this straight," she said, pouring wine for both of us. "You're going to let them open the boutique, struggle financially for a few months, and then swoop in as a mysterious investor to buy it out from under them?" "That's the general idea," I confirmed, though the details matter. The approach has to be perfectly timed and completely untraceable to me. Vanessa raised her glass in a toast. "It's devious and elegant. I approve wholeheartedly." She took a sip. "What about your new job? Will you have time for all this cloak and dagger business? Acquisition? That's actually an advantage. The position at Whitman focuses on acquisitions and turnarounds. This is practically a case study in what I'll be doing professionally." "And what will you do with a boutique if you succeed in buying it?" I'd been asking myself the same question. "It depends on whether it's actually viable with proper management. I'm not opposed to sustainable fashion as a concept. I'm opposed to my savings being stolen to fund someone else's dream at the expense of mine." Vanessa studied me thoughtfully. "You know what I find most impressive about all this? You're not just reacting emotionally. You're thinking strategically, turning a personal crisis into a professional opportunity." I've spent years downplaying my ambition and strategic thinking to accommodate Greg's ego, I said quietly. "Maybe it's time I unleashed those qualities instead." "I'll drink to that," Vanessa agreed, clinking her glass against mine. Later that night, as I prepared for my deposition the next day, I received another text from Greg. "My lawyer says your side is filing motions to freeze assets. This is getting out of hand. Can we please just talk directly? This whole thing has been a misunderstanding." I stared at the message, anger and disbelief warring within me. A misunderstanding? Stealing $110,000 to fund a girlfriend's boutique and a new marketing company was hardly a miscommunication. I composed several responses, deleting each one without sending. Finally, I settled on all communications through our attorneys. Your deposition is Monday. I suggest you prepare thoroughly. Then I turned off my phone and returned to reviewing my notes. Tomorrow would be the first public testimony about the breakdown of my marriage, the first official record of Greg's betrayal. I needed to be clear, factual, and unemotional, qualities I would need in abundance for the chess game that was about to unfold. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking not about what I'd lost, but about what I was in the process of building. A new career, a new sense of self, and potentially, the ultimate object lesson in the dangers of underestimating Claire Parker. My deposition took place in a sterile conference room at Catherine's law firm. Greg's attorney, Richard Bennett, was a silver-haired man with an expensive tie and a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Greg himself was conspicuously absent, a tactical decision, Catherine had explained, to prevent any emotional confrontations that might affect my testimony. For nearly 3 hours, I answered Bennett's increasingly pointed questions about our marriage, our finances, and my knowledge of Greg's business activities. I maintained the calm, measured demeanor I'd perfected in countless corporate negotiations, sticking to facts and dates without revealing the strategy forming behind my composed expression. Mrs. Parker, Bennett said, using my married name deliberately, despite knowing I'd resumed using my maiden name professionally. When did you first become aware of Monarch Boutique? April 3rd, I replied precisely. While recovering from emergency appendectomy surgery, I discovered a transfer of $50,000 from our joint savings to my husband's personal account, made hours after I entered surgery. Upon investigating, I found documentation in our shared cloud storage regarding Monarch Boutique. And you had no prior knowledge of this business venture? None whatsoever. Isn't it possible Mr. Parker mentioned it previously and you simply don't recall? Catherine interjected. Objection. Calls for speculation. Bennett smiled thinly. Let me rephrase. During your marriage, did you and Mr. Parker regularly discuss his work and potential business opportunities? We discussed his employment at Meridian Associates regularly, I replied carefully. He never mentioned plans to establish his own marketing company or to invest in a retail boutique. The questions continued in this vein. Attempts to suggest I might have been aware of or even approved the business ventures, that I might have been disengaged from our financial planning, that perhaps Greg had tried to include me but I'd been uninterested. When Bennett finally concluded, Catherine requested a 15-minute break before beginning her questions. In the privacy of a small side room, she squeezed my shoulder approvingly. You're doing perfectly, she said. Bennett's trying to establish that you were a disinterested spouse who's now exaggerating her surprise. But your timeline is airtight, and your demeanor is unimpeachable. When we returned, Catherine's questioning could not have contrasted more sharply with Bennett's. Where he had been insinuating and circuitous, she was direct and chronological, walking me through the discovery of the diverted funds, the subsequent findings by Melissa Tanner, and the total amount now known to have been diverted, $110,000. Ms. Parker, Catherine said, using my preferred name, in your professional opinion as an attorney specializing in corporate law, would you consider it standard practice for a spouse to establish two business entities using marital funds without the knowledge or consent of their partner? Absolutely not, I replied. It represents not just a breach of marital trust, but potentially improper use of marital assets. And would you consider the timing of the largest transfer, during your emergency surgery, to be coincidental? Bennett objected, but the court reporter noted my answer. I believe the timing was deliberately chosen to prevent me from noticing or objecting to the transfer. When the deposition finally concluded, I felt drained but satisfied. The official record now contained a detailed accounting of Greg's financial misconduct, supported by bank statements, cloud documents, and forensic analysis. Bennett will be scrambling to prepare Greg for Monday, Catherine remarked as we packed up our materials. They didn't expect us to have such comprehensive documentation. I wouldn't be surprised if they reach out with a settlement offer over the weekend. She was right. Saturday morning, an email arrived from Bennett proposing a 55-45 split of assets in my favor, plus return of the initial $50,000 in exchange for dropping further investigation into Greg's business activities. They're desperate, Catherine observed, when I forwarded her the offer. They know Greg's deposition will be a disaster if we press on the financial improprieties, but this offer is still inadequate given the scale of the diversion and the deliberate concealment. I agreed, and Catherine crafted a measured rejection that kept the door open for further negotiation while maintaining our advantage. Meanwhile, I had another intelligence-gathering mission in mind. The Monarch Boutique website announced a special pre-opening event for select customers and industry contacts, a preview night scheduled for the coming Thursday, just 4 days before the official grand opening. I need to see it, I told Vanessa. I need to understand exactly what my money has built. You can't just walk in, she pointed out reasonably. They'll recognize you. Not if I don't go by myself. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? A disguise? Fake mustache? Trench coat? I laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks. Nothing so dramatic, but I do need your help. My plan was simple but effective. Vanessa, who had never met Greg or Madison, would attend the preview event as herself, a successful surgeon interested in sustainable fashion. She would bring a friend, me, with newly darkened hair, glasses I didn't normally wear, and a name that wasn't my own. This is ridiculous, Vanessa said on Thursday evening as I adjusted my glasses in her bathroom mirror. You look exactly like yourself with darker hair. People see what they expect to see, I replied, applying lipstick in a shade I'd never have chosen before. Greg is expecting me to be at home licking my wounds or plotting revenge through lawyers. He's not expecting me to walk into his girlfriend's boutique incognito. And if he recognizes you, I shrugged. Then I leave. But I'm willing to bet Madison has never seen a clear photo of me. Greg certainly never included me in his social media, and I've always avoided having my picture taken. 30 minutes later, we arrived at Monarch Boutique. The storefront was sleeker than I'd expected. Minimalist white walls, warm wooden fixtures, and artfully arranged clothing in muted earth tones. A small crowd had already gathered inside, champagne flutes in hand. Ready? Vanessa asked as we approached the door. I nodded, slipping into the character I'd created. Elise Graham, art gallery director, friend of Dr. Vanessa Chen. My posture changed slightly, my voice rising half an octave, my usual direct gaze softening into something more tentative. A young woman greeted us at the door, checking our names against the invitation list. Vanessa had RSVP'd for herself +1, and we were welcomed warmly into the boutique. The interior was even more impressive than the facade. Custom wooden racks lined the walls, each holding carefully curated pieces with small cards explaining their sustainable origins. A central table displayed accessories, handcrafted jewelry, scarves, small leather goods, while fitting rooms were concealed behind what appeared to be repurposed barn doors. My money had been spent well, I had to admit. The space was beautiful, thoughtfully designed, and aligned perfectly with the ethos Madison had described on the website. What do you think? Vanessa murmured as we accepted champagne from a circulating server. It's good, I admitted quietly. Better than I expected. The concept is solid, the execution is impressive. So this isn't just about revenge? I shook my head slightly. It never was. This is about reclaiming what's mine and determining its value for myself. As we browsed the merchandise, I kept my head slightly down, examining items with exaggerated interest whenever someone passed. Nearby. Across the room, I spotted Madison Hayes for the first time in person, tall and slender as her photos suggested, wearing a simple linen dress that somehow looked both effortless and expensive. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, touching guests' arms lightly as she spoke, laughing at appropriate intervals. I could see why Greg had been drawn to her. She radiated a kind of confident grace that contrasted sharply with my more direct, analytical demeanor. Where I would dive straight to the point in conversation, Madison seemed to dance around topics, creating an atmosphere rather than exchanging information. And then I saw him, Greg, standing near the register, deep in conversation with an older couple. He wore his networking expression, the one I'd seen at countless corporate events. Attentive, slightly deferential, with periodic confident nods. My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my face neutral, turning slightly away while maintaining them in my peripheral vision. Vanessa, noticing my subtle shift, smoothly positioned herself between us, engaging me in animated conversation about a displayed shirt's apparently fascinating button detail. "They're talking to potential investors," I murmured, having read their lips enough to catch key phrases. "The older man is asking about profit projections." "Should we move closer?" Vanessa asked, pretending to consider a nearby scarf. "Not necessary. I've seen enough." But before we could make our exit, Madison herself approached us, champagne in hand. "I don't believe we've met," she said warmly. "I'm Madison Hayes, the owner. Thank you so much for coming tonight." Vanessa handled the introduction flawlessly. "Dr. Vanessa Chen, I received your invitation through the Seattle Women in Medicine Network. This is my friend Elise Graham. She runs the Westlake Gallery." I extended my hand, pulse pounding in my ears. "Lovely space you've created," I said, my voice higher and breathier than normal. "The curation is quite impressive." Madison beamed. "Thank you. I'm so glad you appreciate it. Each piece is selected not just for aesthetics, but for its ethical production methods. We're trying to create a new model for retail, one that values transparency and sustainability." "Ambitious," I commented, "especially in the current retail climate." Her smile flickered just slightly. "It is challenging, but we're confident in our approach." "Are you familiar with sustainable fashion?" "Only as a consumer," I replied. "But I'm curious about the business model. How do you balance ethical sourcing with profit margins? I imagine the price points must be higher than conventional retail." It was a pointed question, but one that would seem natural coming from a gallery director accustomed to luxury pricing. Madison launched into a practiced response about educated consumers willing to pay premiums for ethical products, about building community rather than just selling clothes. "And your investors share this vision?" I asked innocently. Again, that slight hesitation. "We have support from people who believe in what we're building here. It's not just a store, it's a movement." From across the room, I noticed Greg watching our conversation with growing interest. I angled myself slightly away from his line of sight, but continued engaging with Madison. "Well, I think it's wonderful," I said. "Though I do wonder about scalability. Is the plan to remain a single boutique, or are you envisioning expansion?" "We have ambitious plans," Madison replied, her confidence returning. "This location is just the beginning. We're already in discussions with potential partners about pop-up locations and eventual expansion to Portland and Vancouver." It was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. Grand ambitions unsupported by the financial reality I'd uncovered. The disconnect between Madison's expansive vision and the boutique's precarious capital position only confirmed what Melissa Tanner had identified. "Fascinating," I said. "I'll be watching your progress with interest." Greg was now moving in our direction, his networking smile firmly in place but his eyes curious. Vanessa, ever vigilant, touched my elbow lightly. "Elise, we should head out." "If we're going to make our dinner reservation," I nodded, extending my hand to Madison once more. "Thank you for the preview. I'll be sure to stop by after the official opening." We made our exit just as Greg reached Madison's side, his gaze following us with a puzzled expression that suggested he found me vaguely familiar but couldn't quite place me. Outside, I exhaled deeply, adrenaline coursing through my system. That, Vanessa declared, was both the most ridiculous and impressive thing I've ever seen you do. You were literally face to face with the woman your husband left you for, discussing the business he funded with your money, and she had no idea. The glasses helped, I joked weakly, my hands trembling slightly now that the performance was over. It wasn't the glasses. It was the complete personality transplant. Where did Elise Graham come from? You were like a different person. I spent years observing the wives and girlfriends at Greg's corporate events, I explained as we walked to Vanessa's car. The ones he found charming and interesting. I learned their mannerisms, their conversation patterns. I just never chose to adopt them myself. Vanessa's expression softened with understanding. Because that's not who you are. No, I agreed. It's not. But it was useful to pretend, just this once. In the car, I removed the glasses and pulled my hair back to its normal style, physically shedding the Elise persona. I learned some valuable things tonight. Madison is completely committed to her vision. Greg is actively courting additional investors, and they're already planning expansion before proving the concept at a single location. Classic overreach, Vanessa observed. Exactly. They're going to burn through the capital even faster than Melissa projected. I pulled out my phone, making notes while the details were fresh. The inventory is actually quite good, though. Well-sourced, thoughtfully presented. With proper financial management, the core concept could work. So, what's next in your master plan? I looked up from my notes. Greg's deposition on Monday, which should further damage their ability to attract legitimate investors. Then we wait for the grand opening, monitor their performance, and prepare for the moment when they realize they need a financial savior. That moment, I suspected, would come sooner rather than later. The preview event had confirmed everything I'd hypothesized. A beautiful store built on shaky financial ground, run by people whose ambitions outstripped their business acumen. Monday. Morning arrived with unexpected developments. Greg's attorney contacted Catherine an hour before the scheduled deposition, requesting an emergency postponement due to new information requiring review. Catherine denied the request, insisting the deposition proceed as planned. When we arrived at the conference room, Greg was already seated, looking significantly less polished than usual. His normally immaculate hair was slightly disheveled, his expression tense. Bennett leaned close, murmuring urgently in his ear. "Something's happened," Catherine whispered to me. "They're rattled." The deposition began with standard preliminaries, but it quickly became clear that Greg was struggling to maintain his composure. When Catherine began questioning him about the timeline of his relationship with Madison, he stumbled over dates, contradicting himself several times. "Mr. Parker?" Catherine said calmly. "Bank records indicate you began transferring funds to Madison Hayes's personal account in September of last year. Was that before or after you began a romantic relationship with her?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "I don't recall exactly when." "Let me refresh your memory," Catherine interrupted, sliding a document across the table. "This is a credit card statement showing a hotel charge in Portland on September 10th, followed by dinner for two at Ambrosia Restaurant. The reservation, confirmed by the restaurant's records, was under your name for Greg and Madison." Greg paled visibly. Catherine continued methodically through the evidence, establishing a clear timeline of the affair, the financial diversions, and the creation of both Monarch Boutique and Parker Marketing Group. What became increasingly obvious was that Greg had never expected this level of scrutiny. He had operated under the assumption that I would either be too devastated to fight effectively or too financially naive to trace his maneuvers. By the time Catherine reached questions about the $50,000 transfer during my surgery, Greg's confident facade had crumbled entirely. "Why that specific timing, Mr. Parker?" Catherine asked. Greg rubbed his face wearily. "I knew Claire checked the joint account regularly. I needed to move the funds when she wouldn't immediately notice. So you deliberately chose to transfer marital assets while your wife was undergoing emergency surgery?" Bennett interjected. Objection to characterization. But Greg, perhaps finally recognizing the indefensibility of his actions, simply said, "Yes, it was not my finest moment." The admission hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. The deposition continued for another hour, but that moment marked a clear turning point, not just in the legal proceedings, but in my understanding of who Greg truly was. Not a man who had made a mistake or fallen into an unexpected passion, but someone who had calculated the most vulnerable moment to betray me. When we broke for lunch, Catherine was visibly pleased. "We've established clear financial misconduct. His admission about the timing of the transfer is particularly damaging. I expect a revised settlement offer by the end of day." She was right. By 4 p.m., Bennett had emailed a new proposal. A 65-35 split in my favor, complete reimbursement of all diverted funds with interest, and a non-disparagement clause preventing either party from publicly discussing the details of the divorce. "It's a significant improvement," Catherine noted when we discussed the offer. "And frankly, it's close to what we'd likely get from a judge after a full trial." "But it doesn't address the business entities themselves," I pointed out. "Nothing about the boutique or the marketing company." "True. Those would remain his separate property under this agreement, though the funds used to establish them would be returned to you." I considered this carefully. If I accept this settlement and the divorce is finalized relatively quickly, would I be legally prevented from later acquiring Monarch Boutique through a separate business entity? Catherine smiled slightly. "The settlement addresses division of current marital assets. It wouldn't restrict your future business activities as a private citizen, post-divorce." "Then I think we have a counteroffer to make," I said. "I'll accept the 65-35 split and the reimbursement, but I want the divorce expedited as much as legally possible." "That we can do," Catherine agreed. "The mandatory 90-day waiting period is unavoidable, but we can have everything else prepared for immediate finalization once that period ends." As I left her office, I felt an unexpected lightness. The divorce proceedings were moving forward favorably. Greg had essentially admitted his calculating betrayal on the record, and my strategy for reclaiming Monarch Boutique remained intact. The chess pieces were aligning perfectly. Now I just needed to prepare for the endgame. "Eclipse Ventures," I said, testing the name aloud in Michael Whitman's office. "A boutique investment firm specializing in retail turnarounds and sustainable business models." Michael nodded approvingly. "I like it." Subtle nod to Monarch without being obvious. "And the Delaware LLC paperwork came through?" "Yesterday," I confirmed, sliding the documentation across his desk. "Completely anonymous, with Morgan Stanley as the registered agent. Untraceable. To me, by any reasonable investigation, it had been 2 weeks since Greg's disastrous deposition and our subsequent settlement agreement. Catherine had filed all necessary paperwork to start the 90-day divorce countdown, while Melissa Tanner continued monitoring financial activity around both Monarch Boutique and Parker Marketing Group. Meanwhile, I had officially started at Whitman & Associates, diving into the challenging work of corporate acquisitions with an energy that surprised even me. My colleagues were impressed by my quick grasp of complex transactions, unaware that I was simultaneously orchestrating a private acquisition of my own. "And the representatives?" Michael asked, returning to our discussion of Eclipse Ventures. "Amanda, Torres, and David Mercer," I replied. "Former colleagues of yours, now independent consultants. They've agreed to act as Eclipse's public face for the acquisition approach." Michael had introduced me to Amanda and David the previous week, 2 seasoned business development professionals with extensive experience in acquisition negotiations. Both were discreet, professional, and understood exactly what I was trying. To accomplish without passing judgment. Perfect choices, Michael said. Amanda's background in retail will give her credibility when discussing Monarch's operational challenges, and David's financial expertise will allow him to pinpoint their vulnerabilities precisely. He leaned back in his chair. So, what's your timeline? Monarch's grand opening was last Monday, I explained. According to their social media, the first week exceeded expectations. Strong foot traffic, positive press coverage, several sold-out items. The honeymoon period, Michael noted. New boutiques often see strong initial performance from curious shoppers and media attention. It rarely sustains. Exactly. Based on their business plan, they've projected capturing enough momentum from the opening to establish consistent cash flow within 6 weeks. But Melissa's analysis suggests they'll face inventory replenishment challenges by month 2, and their quarterly rent comes due in week 10. So you're looking at making your move. When? Month 3? I nodded. That's my target. By then, the initial capital will be depleted, the first round of major expenses will have hit, and they'll be desperate for an infusion before the critical holiday season. And your divorce? If all goes as scheduled, it should be finalized. Just before I make my move. Catherine has everything ready for immediate filing on day 91. Michael studied me with something like admiration. You've thought of everything, Claire. I'm impressed by your strategic patience. Most people would have gone for quick revenge, but you're playing the long game. I learned from watching my grandmother on the federal bench, I replied. She always said justice delivered in anger is rarely justice at all. Better to proceed, with clarity and purpose. As I left Michael's office, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa Tanner. Activity update. Call when convenient. I ducked into an empty conference room and dialed her number. They didn't get the loan, Melissa said without preamble when she answered. The $75,000 small business loan application was denied yesterday. Credit concerns and insufficient collateral. This was significant news. How will this impact their operational timeline? They'll need to find alternative financing immediately, Melissa explained. Based on their cash flow projections, they were counting on that loan to cover inventory expansion for months 3 through 6. Without it, they'll hit a capital crisis point much sooner than anticipated. How soon? By my calculations, 6 to 8 weeks, maximum. And that's assuming sales remain at projected levels, which is optimistic for a new boutique. This accelerated my timeline considerably. I had planned to wait until month 3 to make my move, but circumstances might force my hand earlier. There's more, Melissa continued. Madison Hayes made a $12,000 withdrawal from the Monarch business account yesterday, transferring it directly to Parker Marketing Group. The same day, Greg withdrew $8,000 from the marketing company's account to his personal account. They're using the boutique to funnel money into their personal accounts? I asked, surprised by the brazenness. It appears so. Technically, it's structured as a marketing fee payment, but the timing and subsequent withdrawal suggest they're accessing operating capital for personal use, which is problematic for a new business with tight margins. This was even better than I had hoped. Not just financial pressure, but potentially improper financial management. Keep monitoring, I said. This could significantly strengthen our position when Eclipse makes its approach. After hanging up, I sent a brief update to Amanda and David, adjusting our timeline. We would need to be ready to move in as little as 6 weeks, rather than the 3 months originally planned. That evening, I met Vanessa for dinner at a new restaurant in Capitol Hill, far from Pioneer Square where Monarch was located. I needed to discuss the accelerated timeline and another idea that had been forming in my mind. So they're already mismanaging funds? Vanessa asked after I filled her in on Melissa's update. That's going to make your takeover even easier. Potentially, I agreed. But it also means we need to move faster than anticipated. Which brings me to what I wanted to discuss with you. Vanessa raised an eyebrow expectantly. I need someone to visit Monarch regularly, I explained. Someone who can establish a relationship with Madison, gain her trust, and provide me with first-hand insights into the store's operations and challenges. And you want me to be your spy? Vanessa asked, looking amused. Think of it as market research, I suggested with a smile. You already made a good impression at the preview event. Madison would have no reason to suspect you're connected to me, especially since Elise Graham was your friend, not Dr. Vanessa Chen. Vanessa considered this, twirling pasta around her fork. What exactly would I need to do? Visit the boutique. Perhaps once a week. Make small purchases. Engage Madison in conversation about the business. Express interest in sustainable fashion. Nothing too intrusive or obvious. Just enough to establish yourself as a valued customer and potential advocate. I can do that, Vanessa agreed, though my acting skills aren't nearly as impressive as your Elise performance. You don't need to act, just be yourself, a successful professional woman interested in ethical fashion. The only deception is omitting your connection to me. Over the next 2 weeks, Vanessa made 3 visits to Monarch, each time reporting back with valuable observations. The foot traffic had noticeably decreased after the grand opening buzz faded. Several items were marked as coming soon on their website, but remained unavailable in the store, suggesting inventory replenishment issues. Most tellingly, Madison's demeanor had shifted from confident enthusiasm to visible anxiety. She was on the phone when I arrived today, Vanessa reported during our Sunday brunch. From what I overheard, she was negotiating with a vendor about payment terms. She kept emphasizing the long-term relationship they were building, classic code for, I can't pay you in full right now. Did she mention anything about additional investment or funding? Not directly, but she did ask if I knew anyone in the impact investment space, investors interested in businesses with social or environmental missions. She tried to frame it as expanding their network, but it was pretty clearly a fishing expedition for the capital. This was exactly the vulnerability I had anticipated. Madison was already seeking additional funding, barely a month after opening. The timeline was accelerating even faster than Melissa had projected. There's one other thing, Vanessa added. Greg hasn't been around much. Madison mentioned that he's focusing on expanding the marketing company's client base. I got the impression things might be tense between them. This was an interesting development. Potential discord between Greg and Madison could further weaken their position when Eclipse Ventures made its approach. Partners unified in crisis were stronger negotiators than those already experiencing strain. The following week brought confirmation of Monarch's financial distress. Melissa reported that Madison had attempted to secure a personal loan using her portion of the business as collateral, a request that had been denied by 3 separate banks. They're running out of options, Melissa observed during our meeting, at her office. Based on their current burn rate and declining sales figures, they'll be unable to pay vendors for new inventory within 2 to 3 weeks. And the next quarterly rent payment? Due in 30 days. Based on their current cash position, they won't make it without an infusion of capital. The time had come to activate Eclipse Ventures. I contacted Amanda and David, providing them with all the financial intelligence we'd gathered and a detailed brief on both Madison and Greg. Your approach needs to appear coincidental but inevitable, I explained during our strategy session at Michael's private club, where we could speak freely, without risk of being overheard. As if Eclipse has been monitoring the sustainable fashion sector and identified Monarch as a potential investment target based on its concept, not its distress. Amanda nodded, making notes. We'll position it as interest in their vision rather than a rescue mission. That preserves their pride while giving us negotiating leverage. Exactly. The initial contact should come from David, focusing on the financial structure and growth potential. Madison is the creative visionary. She'll appreciate that you see beyond the current cash flow challenges to the broader concept. And when do we reveal the actual terms? David asked. Not until they've expressed definite interest in investment, I replied. The first meeting should be exploratory. You're evaluating them as much as they're evaluating you. By the second meeting, they'll be desperate enough to accept terms they might otherwise reject. We spent hours refining the approach, crafting the precise messaging and timing that would position Eclipse Ventures as Monarch's salvation while ensuring they would accept the ownership structure I required. 70% equity to Eclipse in exchange for capital infusion and debt resolution, with Madison retaining 30% and a creative director role, but Eclipse assuming complete financial control. And Greg? Amanda asked. What's his place in the new structure? None, I said firmly. The investment is contingent on severing all ties. With Parker Marketing Group. We'll position it as eliminating conflicts of interest, but it's non-negotiable. With our strategy finalized, David made the first contact, a professional email to Monarch's business address, expressing interest in their concept and requesting a meeting to discuss potential partnership opportunities. To ensure Madison took it seriously, he mentioned Eclipse's recent investments in 2 other sustainable retail ventures, fabricated but plausible examples, and included a link to the Eclipse Ventures website we had created, an impressive digital presence for a company that existed only on paper. Madison's response came within hours, enthusiastic, grateful, and attempting to project confidence despite her desperate circumstances. She agreed to meet David the following afternoon at Monarch. Meanwhile, my divorce proceedings continued on schedule. The mandatory 90-day waiting period would expire in just over 3 weeks, at which point Catherine was prepared to file the final paperwork immediately. Greg had attempted to delay once by requesting additional time to review the financial settlement, but Catherine had successfully argued against any extension. He's stalling, she informed me during our update call, probably trying to stabilize his financial situation before the divorce is finalized. But the judge wasn't sympathetic, given his admitted misconduct. We're still on track for day 91. The day of Eclipse's initial meeting with Madison arrived. I spent it in nervous anticipation, focusing on work at Whitman and Associates while checking my phone regularly for updates from David. Finally, at 5:30 p.m., he texted, "Meeting complete. Call when free." I waited until I reached the privacy of my car in the parking garage before calling him. "It's worse than we thought," David said immediately. "The boutique is practically insolvent. They've deferred payments to 3 major vendors. Their rent check for next month will bounce if written today, and they can't afford to restock their best-selling items." "Did Madison admit all this?" I asked, surprised at the level of disclosure. "Not initially, but when I made it clear that Eclipse conducts thorough due diligence and that transparency would only help her case, she essentially broke down. Claire, she's desperate. She called the boutique her entire life and said she'd do anything to save it." "And Greg? Was he there?" "No, and that's another interesting development. According to Madison, he's been less involved recently, focusing on building the marketing company's client base. Reading between the lines, I suspect he's distancing himself from what he sees as a failing venture. This aligned with Vanessa's observations. Greg, ever the calculating opportunist, was already preparing his exit strategy, leaving Madison to deal with the boutique's collapse alone. "Did you discuss investment terms?" I asked. "Only in general terms." I explained that Eclipse typically takes a controlling interest in exchange for capital infusion and debt resolution. She didn't flinch, just asked how soon it could happen. "I've scheduled a follow-up meeting with both Amanda and myself for next Monday to discuss specific terms." "Perfect," I said. "By then, they'll be even more desperate. Amanda can present the detailed proposal, including the requirement to sever ties with Parker Marketing." After ending the call, I sat in my car for several minutes, processing this development. The Monarch's financial situation was deteriorating even faster than our most pessimistic projections. The boutique that had been funded with my savings, the dream that had justified Greg's betrayal, was imploding barely 6 weeks after opening. There was a certain poetic justice to it all, but I took no pleasure in Madison's desperation. Her vision for the boutique had merit. Her execution and choice of business partner were what doomed it. In a strange way, I was about to save her, dream while reclaiming what was rightfully mine, though she wouldn't know the identity of her savior until much later. That evening, I received an unexpected text from Greg. "We need to talk about Monarch, not through lawyers. Important." I stared at the message, wondering what had prompted this direct outreach after weeks of communication only through our attorneys. Had Madison told him about the Eclipse meeting? Was he trying to shore up their position before the investment discussions progressed? After careful consideration, I forwarded the message to Catherine with a brief note. "Not responding. Thought you should be aware." Catherine replied almost immediately, "Good decision. Any direct communication could complicate the divorce finalization. I'll warn Bennett that his client is attempting end runs around counsel." I put my phone away, resisting the temptation to engage with Greg directly. Whatever game he was playing, whatever angle he was working, I wouldn't jeopardize my carefully constructed strategy by reacting emotionally now. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I had foreseen. Monarch's financial distress, Greg's gradual distancing, Madison's increasing desperation, and my divorce proceeding on schedule. Within a month, if all continued according to plan, Eclipse Ventures would own 70% of Monarch Boutique, I would be legally divorced from Greg, and the final phase of my strategy could begin. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking, not about revenge or justice, but about transformation. The boutique's, yes, but more importantly, my own. The woman I had been 6 weeks ago, shattered by betrayal in a hospital room, had evolved into someone stronger, more strategic, and more confident than I had ever been during my marriage. Whatever happened with Monarch, that transformation was already my greatest victory. Monday morning arrived with a series of urgent texts from Melissa Tanner. Major development. Greg transferred $20,000 from his personal account to Madison's yesterday. She immediately deposited it into Monarch's business account and paid their overdue vendor invoices. Call me ASAP. I stepped out of a client meeting to return Melissa's call, finding a quiet corner in Whitman & Associates' marble-floored hallway. "Where did Greg get $20,000? I asked immediately when Melissa answered. "His accessible assets should be frozen by the divorce proceedings." "That's what makes this interesting," Melissa replied, the excitement of financial detective work evident in her voice. "He liquidated an investment account I didn't previously know about, a small inheritance from his grandfather that predated your marriage. It was technically separate property, not subject to the asset freeze. So he's pouring his own separate assets into Monarch now," I murmured, thinking through the implications. "That's unexpected." "There's more," Melissa continued. "He closed the account completely, $42,000 total. The remaining $22,000 was transferred to a new account in his name alone at Pacific Northwest Credit Union. I believe he's creating a financial reserve separate from both your marital assets and Monarch." This painted a fascinating picture. Greg was simultaneously propping up Madison's failing boutique while establishing his own financial lifeboat, supporting her dream just enough to maintain their relationship while preparing for the possibility of Monarch's collapse. "This changes the dynamics for your Eclipse Ventures approach," Melissa noted. "Madison now has enough operating capital to make it through another 2 weeks, but the fundamental financial problems remain. And Greg's actions suggest he's not fully committed to the boutique's long-term success." I thanked Melissa for the update and immediately called Amanda and David to brief them before their meeting with Madison later that day. This new information would require adjusting our approach slightly. "Madison may seem less desperate today than she did last week," I explained. "She's just received a capital infusion that addressed her immediate vendor crisis, but that doesn't solve her long-term financial structure problems. So we emphasized the strategic partnership aspects over the rescue narrative," Amanda suggested. "Exactly. Position Eclipse as bringing not just capital, but expertise, connections, and a vision for sustainable growth. The $20,000 Greg provided is a bandage, not a cure. And what about Greg? David asked. If he's still financially involved, even peripherally, that complicates our requirement to sever ties with Parker Marketing. Frame it as a clean break for Madison, I advised. An opportunity to establish Monarch as her independent vision, free from conflicts of interest. Position the separation from Parker Marketing as empowering her, not punishing him. Both Amanda and David understood the nuanced approach required. As professional negotiators, they recognized how this small shift in circumstances created both challenges and opportunities for our acquisition strategy. After my call with them, I contacted Catherine to inform her of Greg's financial maneuvers. The inheritance account was disclosed in his financial declarations, Catherine confirmed after checking her files. It's legitimately separate property, so he's not violating the asset freeze by accessing it. Through the fact that he's using it to prop up Monarch rather than, say, paying his legal bills tells us something about his priorities. Do these actions impact our divorce timeline at all? I asked. Not in the slightest, Catherine assured me. We're still on track for finalization immediately after the 90-day waiting period. His financial decisions regarding separate property don't affect the agreed-upon settlement. This was crucial reassurance. My entire strategy hinged on completing the divorce before Eclipse Ventures acquired controlling interest in Monarch. The legal separation needed to be absolute and final before I revealed myself as the power behind Eclipse. At precisely 2 p.m., Amanda and David met with Madison at Monarch Boutique to present Eclipse's formal investment proposal. I couldn't be there, of course, but they had agreed to call me immediately afterward with a full report. While waiting, I threw myself into work, focusing on a complex acquisition case involving a struggling tech startup, ironically similar in many ways to Monarch's situation, though on a much larger scale. The parallels helped sharpen my thinking about our approach to Madison. By 4:30, I still hadn't heard from Amanda or David. The meeting was taking significantly longer than anticipated, either a very good sign or a very bad one. I was just considering texting them when my phone finally rang. "Claire," Amanda's voice came through, sounding both tired and triumphant. "You're not going to believe this. We have an agreement in principle." "Already?" I asked, surprised. "I expected at least another round of negotiations." "So did we," David chimed in, apparently on speakerphone. "But things took an unexpected turn. Greg showed up halfway through our meeting. My heart rate instantly accelerated." "What happened?" "At first, tension," Amanda explained. "Madison clearly wasn't expecting him. There was some pointed whispering before they presented a united front. He introduced himself as her business partner and marketing strategist. He tried to control the conversation," David added. "Started questioning our investment history, our interest in sustainable fashion, our connections to competitors. Classic defensive posturing." "How did you handle it?" I asked. "We stayed focused on Madison," Amanda replied. "I addressed most of my comments and questions directly to her, emphasizing that we saw her creative vision as Monarch's primary asset. That clearly resonated with her while subtly undermining Greg's position." "The dynamic between them was fascinating," David observed. "She's genuinely passionate about the boutique, while he seemed primarily concerned with the financial structure of our offer, particularly the ownership percentages." "Did you present the requirement to sever ties with Parker Marketing?" I asked. "Coming to the critical point. We did," Amanda confirmed. "That's when things got really interesting. Madison actually seemed relieved rather than resistant. She said something like, 'That might be for the best given recent developments.' Greg was less enthusiastic," David added dryly. "But he recovered quickly, shifting to negotiate the terms of the separation, specifically requesting a one-time payment to Parker Marketing for brand development services rendered." This was unexpected but not entirely surprising. Greg was looking for an exit that would allow him to save face and recover some capital. It actually aligned perfectly with my strategy. A clean break would be simpler for everyone. "What terms did you ultimately agree to?" I asked. 70% equity to Eclipse in exchange for a $150,000 capital infusion, Amanda detailed. Madison retains 30% and remains as creative director with autonomy over merchandise selection and store aesthetic. Eclipse assumes complete financial control, including accounting, vendor relations, and expansion decisions. And the Parker marketing separation? A one-time payment of $25,000 for all branding assets, and the termination of all ongoing service agreements, David said. Greg pushed for more, but Madison actually intervened, saying they needed to be realistic about the value provided. I couldn't help but smile at that. Madison herself had essentially acknowledged that Greg's contribution wasn't worth what he believed it to be, a realization I had come to years ago in our marriage. "When do they want to close the deal?" I asked. "That's the other surprise," Amanda replied. "They want to move as quickly as possible." Madison mentioned upcoming rent and payroll obligations. "We've tentatively scheduled final document review for next Monday with closing the following day." This accelerated timeline was both a challenge and an opportunity. The faster we moved, the less time Greg would have to investigate Eclipse Ventures thoroughly or reconsider the terms. However, it also compressed my divorce timeline precariously. The 90-day waiting period wouldn't expire for another 17 days. "Can you push the closing date by 2 weeks without losing the deal?" I asked. Amanda and David conferred briefly before David responded. "We can cite standard due diligence requirements that would realistically take at least that long. As desperate as they are, they don't have many alternatives." "Do exactly that," I instructed. "Frame it as a normal procedure rather than a delay tactic. Maintain momentum with information requests and document preparation, but push the actual closing too, after my divorce is finalized." After ending the call, I sat quietly in my office, processing this significant development. The plan was working even better than I had anticipated. Not only was Madison willing to accept Eclipse's terms, but there appeared to be growing tension. Between her and Greg, tension we could leverage to ensure a clean separation from Parker Marketing and, by extension, from Greg himself. I called Catherine to update her on these developments and confirm our divorce timeline once more. "Day 91 is May 15th, she confirmed. "Judge Harrison has already indicated he'll sign the final decree that morning. By afternoon, you'll be legally divorced." And Eclipse Ventures' acquisition of Monarch Boutique is now scheduled for May 16th, I noted. "Cutting it close, but the sequence is correct." "Just be careful," Catherine advised. "If Greg gets any hint that you're behind Eclipse before the divorce is finalized, he could attempt to claim a share of your interest in Monarch as a marital asset." "He won't," I assured her. "Amanda and David are consummate professionals, and the Eclipse structure is designed to be impenetrable to casual investigation. By the time Greg discovers who he's really been dealing with, it will be too late." The following day, I received an unexpected visitor at Whitman & Associates. I was deep in contract review when my assistant alerted me that Madison Hayes was asking to see me without an appointment. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "Madison? Here? Has she somehow discovered my connection to Eclipse already? Did she say what it's regarding?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "She mentioned it was a personal matter related to Greg Parker," my assistant replied. "I told her you were in meetings all day, but she insisted on waiting." My mind raced. This confrontation wasn't supposed to happen yet, certainly not before the divorce was finalized and Eclipse's acquisition completed. But refusing to see her might raise more suspicions than agreeing to a brief meeting. "Give me 5 minutes, then show her in," I decided. "And please interrupt after 15 minutes with an urgent call." Those 5 minutes were just enough to compose myself and consider the possibilities. Perhaps Greg had finally told Madison about me, and she was here out of curiosity or even guilt. Or perhaps this was something else entirely, a desperate attempt to prevent the divorce from being finalized, orchestrated by Greg himself. When Madison entered my office, she looked markedly different from the confident boutique owner I'd met as Elise. Her face was drawn with stress, her normally perfect hair hastily arranged. She wore one of her boutique's signature linen dresses, but the effect was diminished by her obvious tension. "Ms. Parker?" she began, her voice slightly higher than I remembered. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I know this is unconventional." "What can I help you with, Ms. Hayes?" I asked, maintaining a professional detachment while careful not to reveal that I recognized her from our previous encounter. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "This is awkward. I'm not sure if you know who I am." "You're Madison Hayes," I stated flatly. "You own Monarch Boutique in Pioneer Square. You're also involved with my soon-to-be ex-husband, Greg Parker. Does that cover the essentials?" She flinched slightly at my directness, but nodded. "Yes, that's accurate." "Then I'll ask again. What can I help you with? We have no business together that I'm aware of." Madison took a deep breath. "I'm here about Greg, and about the Monarch. There are things you should know that might change how you view the situation." This was unexpected. What could Madison possibly tell me that I didn't already know? "I'm listening," I said, gesturing for her to continue. "Greg told me you were college sweethearts," she began. "That your marriage had been over emotionally for years, that you were both just going through the motions. He said you were completely focused on your career, that you had separate lives, separate bedrooms even." I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was astonished at the depth of Greg's deception. We had met 3 years after college, had shared a bedroom our entire marriage, and the separate lives narrative was entirely fabricated. "He also told me," Madison continued, her voice dropping, "that the money he invested in Monarch came from his separate savings, built over years from bonuses you weren't interested in." I believed him completely. It wasn't until last week, when some investors started asking detailed questions about our funding sources, that I began to suspect he hadn't been truthful. "And now?" I prompted when she paused. "Now I know he took your joint savings without consent while you were in surgery," she said, looking genuinely distressed. "That he established Parker Marketing Group using marital funds. That he deliberately misled me about the status of your marriage and your knowledge of his investments." Her distress appeared genuine, and I found myself feeling an unexpected flutter of sympathy. Madison had been manipulated by Greg just as I had been, differently, but with the same self-serving intent. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, maintaining my composure. "Because I'm trying to save the Monarch," she replied simply. "And because I think you deserve to know that I didn't knowingly participate in stealing your money. I would never have accepted his investment if I'd known the truth." "And you're just discovering this truth now?" I asked skeptically. "After the boutique is struggling financially and you're seeking new investors?" Madison flushed slightly. "I know how it looks. But yes, the full picture only became clear recently. Greg has been compartmentalizing information, telling different stories to different people. It all started unraveling when Eclipse Ventures began their due diligence process." "Ah, so that was it." Eclipse's thorough financial review had exposed inconsistencies in Greg's narrative, forcing him to reveal more of the truth to Madison. "Eclipse Ventures," I repeated carefully. "Your potential investors?" "Yes," Madison confirmed. "They've made an offer that would save Monarch, but it requires severing all ties with Greg and Parker Marketing." When I told him about this condition, he finally admitted where the initial funding really came from. "I see." I maintained a thoughtful expression while internally marveling at how perfectly our strategy was working. "And what exactly do you want from me, Ms. Hayes?" "Nothing, really," she said, surprising me again. "I just thought you should Know that I'm accepting Eclipse's offer and ending all business relationships with Greg. And that I'm sorry. I didn't know I was building my dream with your money, with your sacrifice. If the boutique succeeds under Eclipse's investment, I intend to repay you personally over time. This unexpected display of integrity complicated my feelings about Madison. She was, perhaps, not the calculating homewrecker I had imagined, but someone who had been deceived alongside me. I appreciate your candor, I said after a moment, though I'm curious why Greg allowed you to meet with me like this. It seems contrary to his interests. Madison's expression hardened slightly. He doesn't know I'm here. Our relationship has become strained since the truth started emerging. I'm making decisions for Monarch based on what's best for the business, not for him. Before I could respond, my assistant knocked and entered as instructed. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that urgent call is waiting for you. I nodded my thanks and turned back to Madison. I'm afraid I need to take this call. Thank you for coming. Ms. Hayes, I wish you luck with Eclipse Ventures. Madison rose to leave, then hesitated. There's one more thing. The grand opening celebration for Monarch is this Saturday. It would be provocative to invite you, I know, but if you wanted to see what became of your investment, you would be welcome. As yourself this time, not as Elise Graham. My carefully maintained composure slipped for just a moment, shock registering on my face before I could control it. Madison offered a small, sad smile. The glasses weren't that effective, she said softly. I recognized you about halfway through our conversation at the preview event. Your questions were too informed, too specific. When I mentioned it to Greg later, his reaction confirmed it. That was the first crack in his narrative. As she left my office, I sat perfectly still, processing this revelation. Madison had known who I was all along, had kept that knowledge to herself, and was now making choices independent of Greg's influence. The chessboard had just been rearranged, in ways I hadn't anticipated. The question now was how to adapt my strategy accordingly. May 15th dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows of Catherine Drummond's office as I signed the final divorce papers. After exactly 90 days of waiting, multiple financial disclosures, and careful legal maneuvering, my marriage to Greg Parker was officially over. Congratulations, Catherine said, accepting the documents from me with a satisfied smile. Judge, Harrison will sign these this morning. By noon, you'll be legally divorced. Thank you, I replied, feeling a curious lightness. For everything. Catherine studied me for a moment. You know, most clients are either devastated or jubilant at this moment. You seem purposeful. I am, I acknowledged. This is just one step in a longer journey. Eclipse Ventures closes the Monarch acquisition tomorrow? Yes, the timing is perfect. Catherine nodded approvingly. I admit, when you first outlined your strategy, I thought it might be excessive, but watching it unfold with such precision has been impressive. You missed your calling. You would have made an excellent divorce attorney. I laughed. I think I'll stick with corporate acquisitions. Less emotional entanglement. As I left Catherine's office, I received a text from Amanda. Final documents delivered to Madison this morning. She's reviewing with her attorney. Greg demanded to be present, but she refused. Closing is still on schedule for tomorrow, 10 a.m. The pieces continue to align perfectly. The growing rift between Madison and Greg worked to my advantage. She was now making decisions independently, prioritizing Monarch's survival over his interests. I hadn't decided whether to accept Madison's surprising invitation to attend Monarch's grand opening celebration that evening. On one hand, it offered an opportunity to see the boutique in its original form before Eclipse took control. On the other, it risked an unpredictable confrontation with Greg. After careful consideration, I decided against attending. Tomorrow would bring revelation enough, and I preferred to control the circumstances of my first face-to-face encounter with Greg since our divorce proceedings began. Instead, I spent the evening with Vanessa, celebrating both my newly official divorce and the impending culmination of my acquisition strategy. To Claire Parker, Vanessa toasted, raising her glass of champagne, who turned betrayal into an opportunity and emerged stronger than ever. And to loyal friends, I added, clinking my glass against hers. I couldn't have done this without you. Please, Vanessa scoffed. All I did was shop at an overpriced boutique a few times and report back. You orchestrated this entire masterpiece yourself. Not entirely, I corrected her. Michael provided crucial guidance. Amanda and David have been perfect front people for Eclipse. Melissa tracked every financial move, and Catherine navigated the legal complexities flawlessly. This has been a team effort. A team you assembled and directed, Vanessa pointed out. Don't diminish your achievement. Later that night, after Vanessa left, I found myself unable to sleep. Tomorrow would mark the culmination of months of planning, the moment when I would reveal myself as the power behind Eclipse Ventures and reclaim what Greg had taken from me. Yet my feelings were more complex than I had anticipated. Madison's visit to my office had complicated the narrative I'd constructed. Her apparent ignorance of the true source of Monarch's funding, her seemingly genuine remorse upon discovering it, and her willingness to sever ties with Greg had introduced an unexpected element of nuance to what I had imagined as a straightforward story of betrayal and justice. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know you've decided not to attend tonight, but I thought you might like to see what your investment built. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that creating this was my true passion, even if the partnership was flawed from the start. Madison attached was a photo of Monarch Boutique, transformed for the evening celebration. The already beautiful space had been enhanced with subtle lighting, elegant floral arrangements, and what appeared to be a small string quartet in the corner. It looked magical, a genuine achievement of aesthetic vision. I studied the image, feeling an unexpected twist of emotion. The boutique truly was beautiful, a manifestation of authentic passion and creative talent. Whatever I decided to do with it after tomorrow, I had to acknowledge that Madison had created something of genuine value, even if it had been built on a foundation of deception. The next morning, I dressed with particular care, a tailored navy suit that projected authority without ostentation, subtle makeup, hair arranged in a sleek chignon. Today, I would step out from behind Eclipse Ventures' corporate veil and reveal myself as the architect of Monarch's acquisition. I arrived at the law offices where the closing was to take place at precisely 9:45 a.m. Amanda and David were already there, reviewing final documents with Eclipse's attorney, a respected corporate lawyer who knew only that he represented a private investor, not the investor's identity. Everything in order? I asked as I joined them in the conference room. Perfect, Amanda confirmed. Madison and her attorney are expected momentarily. No word on whether Greg will attempt to attend, but the agreement explicitly excludes him from the signing. He'll be here, I predicted. Not officially, perhaps, but he won't be able to resist witnessing the transfer of control, even if he's not welcome in the room. At 9:58, Madison arrived with her attorney, a young woman with an earnest expression and a slightly too large suit. Madison herself looked both anxious and determined, greeting Amanda and David with friendly familiarity but casting curious glances my way. This is our principal investor, David explained smoothly, following our agreed-upon script. She prefers to remain anonymous until the documents are signed, but wanted to be present for this important transition. Madison nodded, accepting this with surprising equanimity. I understand. I'm just grateful for Eclipse's interest in preserving Monarch's vision. As the attorneys walked through the final documents, I maintained a professional detachment, speaking only when necessary and never directly to Madison. She periodically glanced at her phone, frowning slightly at whatever messages she was receiving. Is everything all right? Amanda asked after one particularly prolonged frown. Yes, Madison replied, looking up. Just Greg. He's demanding to know what's happening. He's apparently downstairs in the lobby. I exchanged glances with Amanda. Right on cue. The document review proceeded smoothly, with only minor clarifications required. Madison asked thoughtful questions about inventory management and creative control, concerns that reflected genuine care for Monarch's future rather than personal financial interest. At 10:40 a.m., everything was in order. Madison signed first, her signature flowing confidently across each designated line. Then, with a moment of quiet ceremony, I signed as the authorized representative of Eclipse Ventures. Congratulations, Madison's attorney said when the last page was complete. Monarch Boutique is now officially under new majority ownership. Madison exhaled visibly, relief evident in her expression. Thank you, she said, addressing me directly. For the first time. I know this is primarily a business transaction for you, but it means the world to me. Monarch is my dream, and you've saved it. The moment of truth had arrived. I glanced at Amanda and David, who nodded subtly. Everything was official, legally binding and irrevocable. Greg could contest nothing. Actually, Madison, I said, meeting her gaze directly, this is more than a business transaction for me. Her expression shifted to confusion. I don't understand. Allow me to properly introduce myself, I continued, extending my hand. I'm Claire Parker, the principal investor behind Eclipse Ventures. You and I have already met, both as Elise Graham and more recently in my office. Madison's eyes widened, her hand frozen halfway to mine. You? You're Eclipse Ventures? But why? Her confusion gradually transformed to understanding. The money. You're reclaiming what Greg took. Yes, I confirmed. The $50,000 he transferred during my surgery, plus the additional funds he diverted over the months of your relationship. I've essentially bought back what was stolen from me. The conference room door burst open before Madison could respond. Greg stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger, his typically immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. Madison, what have you done? He demanded, ignoring everyone else in the room. You signed without me, after everything I've invested in Monarch? Then his gaze landed on me, and the color drained from his face. Claire, what are you doing here? Hello, Greg, I said calmly. I'm the new majority owner of Monarch Boutique. The papers are already signed. He stared at me in incomprehension, then at Amanda and David, then back to me. What? That's impossible. Eclipse Ventures is… me, I finished for him. Or rather, a Delaware LLC that I control. I'm now the 70% owner of Monarch, with Madison retaining 30% and continuing as creative director. Greg's expression contorted with anger and disbelief. This is insane. You created a fake investment company to, what? Get revenge? This can't be legal. I assure you it's entirely legal. Eclipse's attorney interjected smoothly. The acquisition has been conducted according to all applicable regulations and with full disclosure to Ms. Hayes. Full disclosure? Greg sputtered. Did you know it was her? He demanded, turning to Madison. Not until just now, Madison admitted. But it doesn't change anything. The boutique needed investment, Eclipse, Claire, offered fair terms, and the agreement was signed. It's done, Greg. He turned back to me, his eyes narrowing. This was your plan all along, wasn't it? From the moment you found out about Monarch, you've been plotting this takeover. Not from the very beginning, I replied honestly. Initially, I just wanted my money back. But then I realized there was poetry in transforming what you'd stolen into something that I controlled. I kept my tone matter of fact, free from the anger or triumph he clearly expected. You took my savings to fund Madison's dream without my knowledge or consent. Now I've purchased that dream, legitimately and transparently. Greg's fists clenched at his sides. So what happens now? You shut down Monarch out of spite? Destroy something beautiful just to hurt me? That was never my intention, I said, surprising even myself with the realization that it was true. Monarch is a viable business concept with the right management and adequate capitalization. Madison has created something of genuine value. Then why? He demanded. If not for revenge, why go through all this elaborate charade? Because you stole from me, I replied simply. Not just money, but agency, the right to decide how my own savings would be used. This wasn't about destroying what you built. It was about reclaiming what you took. The fact that I now control the boutique you funded with my money is just structural elegance. Madison, who had been watching this exchange in silence, finally spoke. What are your plans for Monarch? It was the question I'd been wrestling with for weeks. My original impulse, to acquire Monarch and then immediately shut it down, had evolved as I learned more about the boutique, its concept, and Madison herself. That depends, I said, turning to her. The business model is sound with proper capitalization and financial management. The concept has merit, and your curation is impressive. If you're willing to continue as creative director, reporting to me as majority owner, I see no reason why Monarch can't succeed. Relief washed over Madison's face. I am more than willing. This has always been about the boutique for me, not other considerations. She glanced briefly at Greg. Then we have a path forward, I concluded. Eclipse Ventures, which is to say, I will provide the promised capital infusion, restructure vendor relationships, and implement proper financial controls. You'll maintain creative authority over merchandise selection, store aesthetic, and customer experience. And me? Greg interjected, his voice holding an edge of desperation. What's my role in all this? You don't have one, I stated flatly. As specified in the acquisition agreement, all ties with Parker Marketing Group are severed effective immediately. The $25,000 payment for previous branding work will be processed today, but that concludes your involvement with Monarch. Greg's face darkened. You can't just cut me out. Madison and I are business partners who are now separated, Madison interrupted firmly. Whatever our personal relationship, our professional one is over, Greg. I made that clear when I agreed to Eclipse's terms. For perhaps the first time in our entire relationship, I saw Greg truly speechless. The manipulation that had always come so easily to him, the confident control he had exercised over both his personal and professional life, had been completely upended. This isn't over, he finally managed, his voice tight with suppressed rage. Actually, it is, I replied calmly. The divorce is finalized as of this morning. The acquisition is legally complete, and there are no further ties between us. Whatever you choose to do next, it will be entirely separate from my life and from Monarch Boutique. He stared at me for a long moment, then at Madison, who met his gaze with unexpected steadiness. Without another word, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a decisive click. In the silence that followed, Madison exhaled slowly. Well, she said, attempting a small smile. That was dramatic. Indeed, I agreed, finding myself almost sympathetic to her position. For what? It's worth I meant what I said. I have no intention of shutting down Monarch out of spite. That's not who I am. I'm beginning to see that, Madison replied thoughtfully. Though I wouldn't have blamed you if that had been your plan. As the attorneys gathered the signed documents, and Amanda and David quietly congratulated me on the successful conclusion of our strategy, I felt an unexpected sense of completion. What had begun as a response to betrayal had evolved into something more complex. Not just the reclamation of what was taken from me, but the creation of something new that reflected my own values and vision. In the weeks that followed, Monarch Boutique underwent a subtle transformation. The core concept remained, sustainable fashion thoughtfully curated, but the business infrastructure strengthened significantly under my direction. We renegotiated vendor contracts, implemented proper inventory management systems, and developed a realistic expansion strategy based on proven performance rather than optimistic projections. Madison proved to be a talented creative director when freed from financial pressures and Greg's influence. Our professional relationship was initially cautious, but gradually evolved into something approaching mutual respect. We never discussed Greg directly, but I gathered from occasional comments that their personal relationship had ended shortly after the acquisition. 3 months after taking control of Monarch, I visited the boutique on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The space had evolved with subtle improvements, better lighting, more efficient display configurations, a small sitting area where customers could relax and browse lookbooks. Madison greeted me with professional warmth, walking me through recent merchandise additions and customer feedback. As we toured the space, I found myself appreciating what she had created and what I had helped transform into a sustainable business. The August numbers are encouraging, I noted as we sat in her small office reviewing financial reports. If September continues this trend, we'll be positioned for a strong holiday season. I never thought I'd be excited about financial projections, Madison admitted with a small laugh. But there's something deeply satisfying about building something that works on both creative and practical levels. There is, I agreed, which is why I've been considering an adjustment to our ownership structure. She looked up, surprise evident in her expression. What kind of adjustment? I'm prepared to sell you an additional 21% of Monarch, I said. That would make us equal partners at 50-50, with appropriate adjustments to governance and decision-making authority. Madison stared at me in disbelief. Why would you do that? Because you've demonstrated genuine commitment to Monarch's success. Because equal partnership creates the right balance of creative vision and financial discipline. And because, I added with unexpected honesty, this was never about controlling you or punishing you for Greg's actions. I don't know what to say, Madison murmured. I couldn't afford to buy additional equity at market value. I'm proposing a structured arrangement, I explained. The boutique would purchase my shares over time using a percentage of profits. You wouldn't need capital up front. As I outlined the proposed structure, I reflected on how far we had both come from that moment in my hospital room when I first discovered Greg's betrayal. What had begun as a strategy to reclaim what was stolen had evolved into something more meaningful, the creation of a viable business partnership built on mutual respect and complementary strengths. Greg had intended Monarch to be a symbol of his new life without me, funded with resources taken from our shared past. Instead, it had become a testament to my resilience and capacity for transformation, not just recovering what was taken, but reimagining what it could become. The $50,000 he had transferred during my surgery had indeed bought a new beginning, just not the one he had envisioned. Madison and I were building something neither of us had anticipated, free from his manipulation and deception. As I left the boutique that afternoon, I realized I hadn't thought about Greg in weeks. He had become irrelevant to my story, a catalyst for change rather than a continuing presence. The woman who had once defined herself as Greg Parker's wife now defined herself by her own achievements, her own choices, her own vision for the future. That perhaps was the most satisfying reclamation of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.